Well, hello. This unexpected and unusual class, in other words, outside of the usual times, is a special class in honor of and to help with the refuah, the healing of Chaim Yosef Yechiel Michal. May he be well and recover completely from his current situation. This class is also sponsored by him, with many thanks, by him and his wife. Okay, so I think it's appropriate, therefore, that we should talk about the concept of healing. Now, there's a tremendous amount to say, and to fit it all into one class is not going to work very well. But what I would like to do is share with you an image I think is known very well to most people, and that image is the idea of a snake on a stick. Now, for some reason or another, I'm not exactly sure why, people attribute this to Greek mythology, and that is not the original source of it. It could be that it was taken up later, many generations later, in fact, about 2 millennia later, by the Greeks. But this story begins, actually not 2 millennia, about a millennium and a half later by the Greeks. The story actually begins in the Bible, in the Torah, and it is in the section called Parshas Chukas, for those of you who are familiar. And it is in the book of Bamidbar, or Numbers 21, 8. And the verse reads as follows. I'll just read it in the English and then tell you some of the background. God says to Moses, to Moshe Rabbeinu, he says to him, "Make yourself a fiery serpent and place it on a pole. And it will be that anyone who is bitten will look at it and live." So Moses made a serpent of copper and placed it on a pole. And so it was that if a serpent bit a man, he would stare at the copper serpent and live. Now, what's the background to the story? So that's the origin. That's the origin of that image that you can see on the screen over there. And with a snake around a pole. That's really the origin of it. Now, what was the story? The story was that the Jews had been wandering around in the desert for a very long time already. And all they had for food was the manna from heaven, essentially. And they were getting kind of, that had enough of it. They really wanted to go to Israel. They'd been in the desert. They were. It was decreed that they would be in the desert for 40 years because of various sins. Let's not go into them now. But instead of going just across the desert and into Israel immediately, there was a gezerah, there was a decree, because of the spies that didn't want to go into the land of Israel. They wanted to stay in the desert because it was a completely spiritual life. They wouldn't want to have to deal with sowing and planting and plowing and reaping and so on and so forth. They just wanted the manna from heaven. And anyway, they've been in the desert for a long time, and they argue as follows. The people spoke. This is the people, the Jewish people, the Israelites spoke against God and against Moses. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? For there's no food and no water, and our soul is tired of, or had enough of, this insubstantial food," talking about the manna, which was food from heaven, and therefore didn't have the same substance as regular food. So God sends fiery serpents against the people, and they bit the people, and a large number of people died. So others, then some of the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, we have spoken against God and against you. Pray to God and remove from us this serpent." Moses prayed for the people. And then God says to Moses, "Make for yourself a fiery serpent, put it up on a pole, on a stick, and will be that anyone who's bitten will look at it, and that is the origin of the whole concept of the snake on a staff, which is the symbol of healing. Now, the question you might want to ask yourself, and it's a very valid question, obviously, is why would it be that looking at a staff, a snake on a staff, would cure anybody? Why would that have any cure at all? So some of the sages explained that it wasn't the snake that cured anything. It was looking up on high that actually cured the people. It was looking up on high that cured the people. So then the question is, the obvious question is posed. Why then weren't they just told to look up to heaven instead of looking up at this snake on a pole? Now, there's several answers to this, and this is where it gets actually pretty intriguing. Let me just give you a few sources. First of all, the idea that the question that's asked that why aren't they just told to look up to heaven instead of looking at this snake on a stick. So that is a Mishnah, a rabbinical teaching at the end of chapter 3 of the tractate Rosh Hashanah. Can also be found in the Talmudic tractate Rosh Hashanah 29a. In any event, what is the idea over here? What is the concept behind this idea of looking at a snake? Now, one of the teachings that is extremely interesting when it comes to this kind of thing, when it comes to illness, is that what we're being told is not only look up towards the heavens, what we're being told is look towards the root of these things. In other words, if there is an illness in the physical body down here, ultimately its root is up above. Its root is not necessarily in the body itself. The root is, in fact, in some aspect of the soul that needs cleansing, that needs rectification, that needs what is called a tikkun. And that is why the illness comes out in the body. The illness comes out in the body in our generations, and I'm not saying that this is the way it was necessarily in all generations. That's where it's always been. But this is certainly true in our generations. How do we know that it's true in our generations? Because our sages tell us that is the case. We have been given the privilege to be able to deal with a problem in the spirit, a problem in the soul, by having that problem revealed to us as a problem in the body. Now, one of the great sages of one of the great Jewish sages of the Middle Ages, his name was the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban, points out that the way of the Torah, the way of the Bible, the biblical way, is that the thing itself which causes the problem is in fact the solution to the problem. Let me explain. What caused the problem over here was that they were bitten by snakes. That was the physical problem which was visible to the person himself. He was bitten by a snake, and therefore the poison in the snake had the possibility of killing him. God forbid. But what was the origin of that thing? What was the origin of the snake that came and bit him? The origin was that they bad-mouthed Moses and God. They bad-mouthed him. Now, what's the power of the snake? The power of the snake is in his poison, in his mouth. And that's what our sages tell us. The power of the snake is in his mouth. And therefore, because their mouths were full of poison in the sense that they spoke badly and ungratefully and untruthfully, if the truth be told, against Moses and against God. It wasn't God's fault. It wasn't Moses' fault that they were in the desert for 40 years. It was their own. And the fact that they were given this food from heaven, this manna, was in fact a gift from heaven, to the extent that there was a jar of manna that was placed in the ark in the Holy Temple, and was always kept there, was placed in the ark, and to remind us of what it was that we were fed on throughout that time in the desert. And further, our sages tell us that the Torah was only given to those who ate the manna. In other words, it was never given before. It wasn't given to Abraham. It wasn't given to Isaac or to Jacob or to anybody else. It was only given to those who ate the manna. In other words, they reached a certain level of spirituality where they could eat spiritual food, so to speak, the food of angels, which is what the manna was. And in that way, they were worthy. This was, in a sense, a purification that allowed them to, that purified them sufficiently that they would be able to receive the Torah, would be able to receive the biblical teachings, the 5 books of Moses, be able to receive the 10 commandments, to hear and to receive the 10 commandments. Okay, let's go a little bit further. We mentioned that the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, explains that the illness is a sign of the cure. The illness itself is a sign of the cure that is necessary. Therefore, as in our case, in this particular case that we talk about, the biblical case, because they were bitten by snakes, so they would understand that a snake, the concept of snake, was their undoing. In other words, they had to look up towards the root of what their problem was. They had to find out what the origin of this thing was in a spiritual sense in order to solve the problem, because one can never cure unless one understands what the illness is. You can't cure an illness without understanding what it is, without knowing what the origin, the spiritual origin in this case, and if the truth be told in all cases, is. And therefore, when they understood what the origin was, then they knew how to rectify it. They had to look towards the spiritual origin of things. So the Ramban comes along and he tells us that often the cure for some kind of illness is presented by the illness itself. Now, we actually know this from modern medicine. Interestingly enough, when a person has when a certain illness is prevalent, then one becomes vaccinated. The answer to it, like polio, for example, polio is almost non-existent. Certainly in the Western world today, polio is almost non-existent, if actually non-existent, simply because we're vaccinated against it. What's the vaccine? The vaccine is dead polio microbes or whatever they call them, germs or whatever it is, that which causes the polio illness, once those microbes or those germs or whatever it is, I forget what they're called, have been killed by, I think, radiation. They do it by radiation of some sort or another. But once they died, and then a person is injected with that, then the body already knows how to deal with that particular illness. So that if a live instance of that happens, immediately the body produces the antibodies and kills the disease because it knows how to deal with it already from the dead microbes, from the dead polio microbes. I don't know what that would be called. Someone can correct me and figure out what the right word is. In any event, the same thing is true, says the Ramban, of all types of illness. The cure is from the illness itself. Therefore, he gives another example. When the Jewish people came to, as they were going through the desert, they came to a place where there was no water, and they came to a sort of a lake or a river, and they couldn't drink the water. It was a lake, and they couldn't drink the water ki marimheim, because the water was bitter. So God tells Moses, throw a tree into the river, and our sages tell us what kind of tree was this. This was a tree called a hidofni, which is a tree where the wood is extremely bitter. Now, I don't know what kind of tree that would be today. I mean, there's various kinds of trees that have very bitter wood. Wormwood is one of them, but the wormwood tree, I don't know what kind of tree it was. It doesn't really matter. The point is that the bitterness of the tree cured the bitterness of the water. Vayimtuku hamayim, the water became sweet, and then they were able to drink it. So very often, why do I say very often? In all cases, the cure for the illness is the illness itself. How so? If one can trace the illness back to its source, what is necessary to be rectified in the soul, and we have been blessed, as I mentioned before, by the fact that now diagnosis is so clear as to exactly what the illness is and how it works and so on and so forth, then we can trace back the origin of the illness in a spiritual sense, rectify the spiritual, and find the cure in the physical. Now, this doesn't mean, and I'm not suggesting for one moment, in fact, completely the opposite. I'm not suggesting that one should not use natural means to cure diseases. We see that the bitter water was cured by throwing a physical tree into the water. The snake poison was cured. The people who were bitten by snakes were cured by seeing a snake on a stick. In other words, they had to turn their eyes up to the origin of what the snake was. The snake was lifted up on high on the stick, lifted up on high. They lifted their eyes up to the heavens. In other words, they went to seek out the origin of what their illness was in a spiritual sense. And once they would be able to understand that, then they would be cured. So I'm not suggesting that one shouldn't use physical means. One should just rely on faith healing or anything like that. No. The Torah says explicitly that v'rapo yirapeh, he shall surely heal. It's talking about a doctor, about which our sages say that doctors have been given permission to heal. In other words, one should use doctors when necessary. If an operation or something like that is necessary, one has to do it. If medication is necessary, one has to take it. But what helps the idea, what helps the illness, is understanding what the origin is in a spiritual sense. So the Ramban goes on to say a very interesting thing. He said you would think that when a person is being bitten by a snake, the last thing he wants to see is a snake. Similarly, when a person is bitten by a dog, he goes on to say, the last thing, they're afraid of dogs from now on. You can imagine that a person who's been bitten by a dog, especially a rabid dog, would be very, very afraid of dogs from then on, says the Ramban. And that's why they were told to look at it, because running away from the cause of their problem would not be the way to cure it. It was miraculous, in fact, that their cure had to be, in a sense, miraculous. One of the had to be miraculous, in the sense that even though they were afraid of the image of a snake on a staff, even though they were afraid of that, nevertheless, that would be their cure. Miraculously, the thing itself that caused the problem was the cure to the problem. Now, interestingly enough, this whole idea that the cause of the problem is its own cure is something that applies in all walks of life and in all aspects of life. We've told the story many times before about a sage whose name was Rabbi Nachum Gamzu. He was called Gamzu because whatever happened, whatever negative thing happened, he always used to say Gamzu l'toiva. Gamzu means this also. This also is for the good. And therefore, the whole concept of seeing the good in something that was perhaps negative, changed it, transformed it into positive. That transformation, that reframing of a negative thing into positive, made it into a positive thing. The famous story is told that he was sent on a mission. The Roman emperor was planning to annihilate a certain section of the population of Jews, and he was sent as an emissary of the Jewish people in Israel to the Roman emperor, and he took with him a gift, otherwise known perhaps as a bribe, but a gift for the Roman emperor. And this gift was a chest full of jewels and silver and gold and obviously worth a tremendous amount of money. The journey to Rome took some time, so he stayed at an inn along the way. And at that inn, robbers, thieves, or the innkeeper emptied out his chest and filled it with dirt, unbeknownst to him, because he didn't even look inside. He gets to the Roman emperor. The emperor opens the chest. They see there's dirt over there, and now the emperor is absolutely furious. What, are you making a mockery of me? So the story told in the Talmud is that one of his advisors, who according to the rabbis, was actually Elijah, the prophet Elijah in disguise. Elijah became an angel, and it was the prophet of Elijah, the angel, in disguise, who came and suggested to the king that perhaps this is what the Jewish legend has it, that Abraham used dirt, exploding dirt, to defeat his enemies. He threw dirt at them and exploded in that, sort of gunpowder. And they tried it, and in fact, it was gunpowder. So was it gunpowder to start off with? I'm sure they didn't fill the chest with gunpowder, but miraculously, that's the way it happened. This is another explanation of that they put the snake on a staff. The word for staff in Hebrew is nes, vayisimehu al hanes. They put it upon a staff. But the word nes, why is it called a nes? Because it's a staff that lifts things up on high. It's a very tall stick, a tall staff. However, the another meaning of the word nes is miracle. Vayisimehu al hanes, that the cure was put upon a miracle. In other words, the cure itself was, in a sense, miraculous. The truth is, all cures are miraculous, even healing by natural means. The fact that one can prevent illness by injecting someone with the illness, with a polio vaccine, for example, is in itself a miraculous thing. How does that happen? How does that work? Well, we can explain it logically, but why it works, even though we can explain it and we can understand it, etc., why it should actually work is pretty amazing. Yeah, that in itself is a miraculous kind of a thing. Yes, it has an explanation, but nevertheless, it's miraculous. So the cure, therefore, for illness is v'rapo yirapeh. He shall surely cure. God will cure illnesses when one makes a decision that the cause of the illness, what caused my illness, whoever the person is that's ill, what caused the illness is going to become the person's cure. In other words, the fact that this person has an illness is the clue as to what that person needs to do in order to rectify that illness. Now, it might not just be the name of the illness that's important, it could be where it is. Let's say a person has a problem with the heart, or a person has a problem with the liver, or a person has a problem with the stomach, whatever it may happen to be. So there's ways of understanding like what it is in a spiritual sense that overcomes that weakness. And the illness is a clue as to exactly what it is that the person has to do. So again, the fact that we're being told by the illness itself what the cure is, that itself is a miraculous thing. It's vayisimeu al hanes. It's putting the cure upon a miracle. The cure is in itself miraculous. And therefore, we will find that in most cases, I don't want to say in all cases because I haven't researched all cases, but in cases where a person puts themselves in a higher spiritual framework, he does what's called tshuva. He returns to a more spiritual state than he was or she was beforehand. That in itself changes the person's circumstances so that the cure that the doctor produces will in fact work. Because sometimes it happens that the cure that the doctors suggest doesn't work, either because they didn't find the source of the illness, or because in this particular case it didn't particularly work, or whatever. And therefore, in order for the cure to work better, in order for it to work well, what's necessary is a spiritual transformation, a spiritual change inside. It's not just a physical thing that will cure the issue. It also has to be a spiritual transformation. Now, let's not assume, therefore, that the illness is as a result of sin. It can be, but it's not necessarily the case. It could be that a person has a pagam, a blemish, for whatever reason, perhaps from a previous incarnation, or from something that was done in the person's youth, or simply because it's time to move on to a new and higher spiritual level. Therefore, the person gets that particular illness, the cure to which is going to lift that person up to a higher level, or will rectify the pagam, the blemish, which was caused either in a previous life or in early on in this life, or in some way or another. And that hopefully will move the person on towards a higher and better situation. So therefore, the whole concept of refuah, healing, actually comes from a much higher place than the person was on before. The words, if I can find it here, just let me see. All right, let me just write it in over here. 1 second. Let me just write. I'll do this here. Share a screen. Okay. Let's make it much larger. 1 minute. We can make this large enough that you'll be able to see. Key. Ami. Rofecha. Okay, so here you see these letters here. I didn't have this prepared beforehand. I apologize. But these words spell, if you have a look, not in this order, but they spell the word arich. Arich. I'll write that in English as well. Here we go, arich. Arich, and it stands for Arich Anpin. Arich Anpin is one of the levels of Keter. It's the level of Keter that is closest to manifestation. It's closest to Chokhmah. When it says, V'ha-Chokhmah ma'ayin timotze, and Chokhmah comes out of ayin, let us yeah, there we go. I'm just waiting for this. Here we go. Okay. Here's Chokhmah, and there's Keter, right? This is Keter. So when it says that Chokhmah comes out of Keter, when it says that Chokhmah comes out of ayin, out of nothingness, it means it comes out of Keter. Why is Keter called nothingness? Because Keter is not manifested in limited categories like all the other Sfirot are. The Keter is a transcendent Sphira, and therefore it is called ayin, it is called nothingness, because it's not something that we can magdir, something we can define, something we can limit into intellectual categories. Now, Keter itself has several aspects. The lower aspect of Keter, the one from which Chokhmah derives, is called Arich. There's another level called Atik, and there's a level beyond that called Radla, Reja, Deloit, Yada, but never mind. The most important thing is that the level of Keter that relates to what we're talking about here is called Arich. As we see, Arich or Arich Anpin. Arich Anpin is the full name of it, but Arich in brief. So the initial letters of the verse, I am God who heals you, Ki ani Hashem Rofecha, I am God who heals you. The initial letters of that spell the word Arich, right? There's the Aleph. There's the Aleph for the first letter. There's the Resh for the next letter, and then the Yud, and then the Chaf, except that the Chaf at the end of a letter is made into a long Chaf. Okay, so without getting into the technical details of it, healing comes from Arich. It comes from a level beyond. It comes from the level of miracle because it comes from Keter. So hopefully, with this brief overview of the concept of healing, the healing will come immediately and speedily and completely to all those who need healing, and in particular to our good friend Chaim Yosef, Yechiel Michel. May he be well and not suffer any consequences of his illness at all. Okay, we'll call it that. We'll call it a day, and God willing, I will post this shortly on YouTube.